Yeah, there's a lot going on, and so I'm happy to be back talking about the market and the update and all the good stuff that we have going on. I want to kind of start by managing expectations in a way when you and the reason why I want to do that is because when you look in the rear view mirror, and it's important to keep in mind that all of the nerdy economic data, the housing stuff that we put out every month or what have you, is always backward looking, right? It's data that happened last month, the month before. People crunch the numbers. It takes time to get that stuff posted, et cetera, et cetera. And so whenever we're talking about what happened with home sales, what happened with home prices, those numbers are largely describing things that happened in the past. And the reason why I start with that caveat is because those figures are pretty encouraging, right? There's lots to be optimistic about when you're just taking a kind of pure data-driven approach to what's going to happen, right? The macro indicators have started to move in the right direction, and housing in particular continues to be at the kind of leading edge of that growth, both in terms of what's happening with prices, what's happening with sales. That's true in Tulare County as well, where we continue to grow by double digits for sales and prices. And yet when you kind of look out towards the future, I wouldn't say that we're concerned necessarily, but there's just a lot more that we don't know, right? There's a lot less visibility out there. I think that we have some red flags emerging, and in some ways the strong market is creating challenges of its own. I also think that it's really starting to underscore and maybe bring back to the forefront some of the structural challenges that we had before this crisis, where affordability was a huge problem, housing inventory was a problem, and we've seen this huge resurgence in buyer demand, which is ultimately a good thing. That's what we want. We want people to want to buy homes and be out there buying homes and getting their foot on the property ladder and all of that stuff. But it does make our kind of supply issues and the kind of consequent interplay between supply and affordability even more urgent that we start to address, right? Because prices are going up really fast now, and it kind of starts to beg the question. And actually, people have been asking me lately, are things going too good? Are we in a housing bubble? Are we on the precipice, the way that our brother-in-law told us that the market's about to fall apart, right? We always remember that kind of brother-in-law effect. And I think you have that when the market is down, right? That people think it's going to get worse and are inherently pessimistic. And you have folks who think that when things are going good, that the other shoe's about to drop and that it's about to be 2008 all over again. And so I want to share with you some structural analysis that I've done just to how sustainable are home prices, right? When you look at the fundamentals, I think up to the end of last year, prices were largely explained by just basic mathematical fundamentals. What about now? How does that change? And really, for me, it's not whether there's more risk or there isn't more risk. I think you hear folks say that there's nothing to worry about. This time is different. There's always some degree of risk out there. And so for me, it's not about saying that there's no risk or there is risk or not. It's about understanding the magnitude of the risk. Is it a big risk? Is it a small risk? Is it something that we should be worried about? What does a worst case scenario look like? And those are the kinds of questions that I want to pose to you and show you how I think through some of those questions, so that, not just so that I can justify my own student loan, but I think these are going to be the types of questions that we're going to want to talk through with our clients, because our clients are suffering from that brother-in-law effect, whether they, think it's time to hold off on buying and wait till prices come down, or that it's not a good time to sell, or what have you. There's all kinds of reasons why you want to be well-versed in kind of these fundamentals. And of course, I'll leave you then with the forecast after I kind of, beat you over the head with all the contextual stuff. Then I'll try and wrap up with what it all means for us going forward in the market as kind of real estate professionals for the rest of 2021 and into 2022. And I think that the moral of the story there is that we are still optimistic, but we're not overconfident. What we do hope happens is that, and what Econ 101 tells us should happen is that when prices start to go up rapidly, then that should start to bring supply on of its own accord, right? People look out and realize they can make good money on their homes. They want to cash in on some of that equity they've accumulated. And so hopefully we start to see some of that pent up supply where people didn't want to put their homes on the market, where there was nothing to buy, start to open up. And that gets these price numbers to start to cool down towards something that's more sustainable from a long-term standpoint. So that's the hope. And hopefully that's, the direction that we're headed. There's some indications that we're going to start to see some of that, but let's go through the really positive rear view mirror stuff, because there is a lot to be optimistic about when you look out at the kind of broader data, right? These are the daily COVID cases, and they've been now below 1,000 in terms of new cases for a long time. We've had over 37 million, or roughly 37 million doses of vaccine given out, which is 55 roughly percent of the population that's gotten at least one shot. So that's good just from a kind of human standpoint, but it's also important from an economic standpoint. And what I'm showing you here is just how closely tied those kind of public health numbers are to what happens in the broader economy. So this is kind of the summary of California's labor market experience going through COVID. So if you go back in your time machine to February of 2020, we entered this crisis with about 17.7 million non-farm jobs. And by April, we had shed a little bit more than 2.7 million of those jobs. That was the fastest period and the most significant job declines that we've ever recorded here in California since they began tracking non-farm data. But we bottomed out fairly quickly as the economy started to open back up after that really tight initial clampdown in March and April. What we saw was that between May and November, the economy went back into a growth mode. We started to open back up. We added almost 1.1 million of those jobs back. But if I back up a step, what you can see is that in November, the public health numbers really started to blow up, right? They started to get out of control, and the state really started to clamp back down on that broader economy. And what that meant was that, between November, the end of November and the end of January, the state very quickly, almost immediately overnight, went back into a jobs losing mode, right? We lost just over the course of those 2 months, another 155,000 jobs after having rallied for the previous 6 months. Before that, what happened in February and March, those numbers started to really come back down. And you can see that as the economy is able to open back up again, we go right back into a job creation mode. And in fact, we've added almost 400,000 new jobs just since those public health numbers started to come back down the other side. So we're still about 1.4 million jobs away from that pre-crisis level. But, the optimistic news is that we're going to start to look a lot more like the kind of April to November and March to April or February to April time period, where as the economy starts to open back up, more of those retail, restaurant, tourism jobs start to come back, that we will just continue to chip away as those kind of COVID numbers move in the right direction. What about housing, right? Because that's kind of just part of the equation. Not only is just the economy in general getting better, right? But really we had a crisis that kind of was a perfect storm for housing. When we talk about those 2.7 million jobs that we lost, which I just walked you through, what's interesting, and I didn't, bring all the kind of charts and tables because I didn't want to bore you to death with this stuff, but I have crunched these numbers. And what's interesting is that, high income earners were relatively unaffected by this crisis. In fact, if you look at the 2.7 million jobs lost divided across industries, what you can see is that 90% of the jobs that we lost were in our, in the industries that on average paid less than $100,000 a year. Industries, the 5 highest paying industries that pay more than $100,000 a year on average, accounted for less than 10% of the job losses. So you had these high income earners who, let's face it, when you look at California's housing affordability situation going into the crisis, we were already in a position where you had to be in that kind of upper quintiles of income to be able to consider home ownership in the first place. And those were the folks who, again, have the most kind of remotable jobs, if you will, right? Like the spreadsheet nerds like me, if we have access to internet, if we have our laptop and our Microsoft Excel, we can continue to earn money and remain employed. In fact, we might be doing even better financially as a result of the crisis because we're no longer commuting to the office, paying for parking, doing all that kind of stuff. And we're also just getting a lot more of that time back through the kind of commuting process. What else happened there? We had a structural shift in the importance of housing, right? We saw almost immediately with the onset of the crisis that the median sized home that was closing on the MLS went up by about 120 square feet, right? It went from about 1,700 square feet to about 1,850 square feet or so. That's a statewide number. Obviously, it varies depending on where you are. But to me, that's about a 10 by 12 room, right? That's a home office. So we had also, the need for the home that is much more acute than ever before. It's not just the place where you kind of go back, grab a bite to eat, lay your head on the pillow before you head off to work the next day, right? It's where you live, it's where you work, it's your gym, it's your office, it's your bar, it's your restaurant, right? I'm going to go downstairs probably and try and squeeze in a spelling test, the last spelling test of the year here, between Zoom meetings, and that all combined together with the fact that those folks who are in a position to consider home ownership, that really kind of lit that fire so that you had, both an economic position and wherewithal to be able to do it, and this kind of need for housing that was more urgent and more important to us than ever before. We also had a lot more flexibility, right? I'm not having to go to Koreatown in LA every day and be there by 8 o'clock in the morning. And in some cases, we know that at least some of that's going to be permanent. Even if I have to go back to the office, it's maybe going to be a couple days a week or, a couple of weeks a month. It gives me more flexibility, more options in terms of where I get that house, right? I can maybe go out and get a house on the river in Three Rivers now if I wanted to, because I don't have that same, kind of need to be close to the office. And I think that when you put all three of those things together, the insulation from the effects of the crisis, the structural importance of housing, and the increased flexibility, and you put that all into the pot and you mix it around with 3%. Oops, excuse me. My charts are freaking out on me. But when you put it all into the pot and you mix it around with 3% mortgage interest rates, it really does create that kind of perfect storm for housing. And yes, we have seen rates that have gone up from 2.6% to 2.99% last week. But again, I always remind you to channel that inner Ira Levine, right? I'm the son of that guy who was always bragging about the 12% mortgage rate back in the 80s. And I think from that standpoint, it is still very, very favorable. We're not in that kind of high inflation, high interest rate environment. And so even when rates go up a tiny bit, rates are still pretty favorable. And actually, I think that the fear of higher rates down the road might actually motivate, buyers to want to move sooner than later, lest they be, staring down the barrel of 4.5% interest rates in a couple of years time. And indeed, we saw that all four of those factors did, in fact, combine to create the biggest share of first-time buyers in the market that we've seen in over a decade. Almost 40% of the market last year was first-time home buyers. And yet when you look at who these folks were, and I didn't bring this stuff with me, but they tended to be the relatively more affluent first-time home buyers. So at least 33% of the first-time buyers last year put down at least 20%, which is a different, type of a first-time home buyer than we had in 2004, 5, and 6. They were putting their foot on the property ladder for the first time, but they tended to be those relatively more affluent, long-term renters who were in those high-income earning jobs, maybe had some boomer parents that were willing to help them out with down payments and things like that, and wanted to finally take advantage of those low rates. It wasn't, unfortunately, the kind of middle class kind of $50,000-$60,000 a year income earner scrapping their way into the housing market. And I think when you kind of interpret that through the lens of the kind of economic data that I just shared with you, where again, those high income earners are the ones who largely remained employed throughout this crisis, then that phenomenon where we have a lot of first time buyers, but they tended to put a lot of money down and be relatively high income starts to really make a lot of sense. And indeed, what's interesting as well is that if you look at the sales numbers in April, not just April, but really February, March, and April, what you can see is that after an initial surge in people really leaving the city, those with the wherewithal to, go get that river house in Three Rivers or move to Tahoe or get a cabin in Big Bear or what have you, that really drove the first part of the recovery, right? We're talking about May, June, July, August of last year. But what you can see now is that the kind of core of California, the Bay Area, Southern California, and the Central Coast, which clamped down much quicker, much harder, kept it clamped down, are now finally starting to see the same kinds of growth, right? If you kind of look at the Central Valley in relative terms from a statewide standpoint, the numbers seem pretty low. 39% is still explosive growth in home sales. It's just that we didn't take as long to kind of get out of the starting blocks as San Francisco and LA did, which are now seeing that really exaggerated growth that you're seeing here. So don't be fooled. This is happening in our neck of the woods as well. In fact, if you look at sales in Tulare County as a whole, just in April, we were up almost 19% year to year from where we were at the same time in 2020. That's even as the median price went up by 22.5%, right? So we were joking about this before we clicked record, right? But it's that's for people who are looking at $1.8 million median home prices in San Francisco, that's still way more affordable and doable, right? But that is not a cheap number. We're looking, that's coming up on the median price that you see in the rest of the United States, meaning that it's, now cheaper to live in most other parts of the country than it is even to live in Tulare County. But that's, again, a testament to just how strong the demand is. If you look, the sales are 321 closed single family transactions in April, but we ended April with about 210 units left on the MLS, right? So we're just burning through. We can't put them onto the MLS fast enough. The median time on market is 8 days, right? That's the median that it takes to go from hitting the MLS to going pending, right? And that's a median. So what that means is that half the homes that closed in April went pending in less than 8 days, right? Which is again, pretty incredible. There's a median sales to list price ratio of 100%, and less than 20% of those active listings that are still active and haven't sold for one reason or another have actually done any kind of price cut. So just hugely competitive. It does vary a little bit when you go market by market, and I've sorted these low to high. So you can see that sales in Porterville weren't up by the same 20%, but it's not because of a lack of demand. We're still seeing double-digit growth in home prices, really quick time on market. I would argue that the 60% decline in active listings last month really is the thing holding the market back. But if you look at kind of the kind of core of the county, if you will, you can see almost an 18% increase in the city of Tulare, even as prices continue to go up. And again, listings are less than half of what we're selling. So just incredibly competitive. Visalia up over 20%. Again, even as prices were up by more than 20%. Look at Visalia, median time on market, 6 days. So it's even hotter than the state as a whole, hotter than the countywide average. And on median, if you're a seller, right, you are getting full asking price. And that's absolutely incredible. These are the kinds of things I'd be printing off to show to those folks who are suffering from the brother-in-law effect out there, who doesn't think it's a good time to sell their home, or that you don't sell your home because the market's about to tank. Well, in Visalia, you can expect to go pending in 6 days with minimal haggling over that price. And that's the kind of stuff you want to know as a buyer, right? Look at Exeter, up 50% from the same time last year at almost a $340,000 median price. price, just pretty incredible. Top end of the price spectrum, you see again, very quick time on market, but that lack of listings is really holding back the closed sales. Actually, price premiums happening in Danube at over a $353,000 median price. And that's kind of the tail of the tape across the whole state. So these are statewide numbers. And in fact, if you look at the market broken up, not market by market, but segment by segment, you can see that those high income earners and the kind of relative economic advantage that they still maintain showing itself in the high end, right? So 2 million and up was up by more than 300% last month from where it was at this time last year. 1 to 2 million was up 185% or so, and 750 to a million was up, over 130%. Everything else was up as well, but just the top end of the market is just really doing well and growing head and shoulders above the rest. These are the folks that, again, and this is a typo. It's not more than, we sold more $1 million homes last month than we sold under 500,000, not under a million, under 500,000, which is a huge chunk of the market still. But again, I think through that economic lens where those high income remote workers are driving the show, this starts to make sense that there's a lot of high income or a high end homes, second homes, vacation homes, and just big primary residences driving the show. That's one of the reasons why when you look at the median price stuff, that we have the strongest, growth in home prices that we've ever recorded. We were up 34% and change last month to a median price, an all-time high median price of almost $814,000. And that is, again, pretty incredible when you consider that that's a median, right? So that means that half the homes that closed last month, again, closed at a price higher than $814,000, which is, for those of us who have a foot on the property ladder, is great news. For those of us with kids or, kind of don't want to be the ones holding our nose, flying to Idaho every Christmas or something to see grandkids, that's problematic, right? Because, unfortunately, and I know that folks on this call tend to work on commission splits and stuff like that, but again, as a wage and salaried employee, I can assure you that incomes aren't growing at 34.2%. I wish they were, but that puts us farther behind the 8 ball from an affordability standpoint as we move forward. So some of that is because we're selling a lot of $2 million homes. And so it tends to drag up that kind of median price number. But some of this is based on honest to goodness market competition, right? When you look at both the median sales to list price in California, which hit 103.3% last month, meaning that the median home had a 3.3% premium above list, or days on market, which hit 7 days statewide, which is an all-time low as well. There is just some real honest to goodness excess demand out there. We have too many buyers and not enough homes to put them in, so they're selling above list and they're selling quick. And I think that can't be overstated, even as I think that it's exaggerated in those headline numbers by the fact that we see a lot of $2 million homes sold. So I don't know if I did a good job of walking that kind of muddy line of nuance, but the bottom line is that almost 70% of the homes that closed in April closed above asking price, which is again another all-time high. Pretty much every stat we reported in April was an all-time high, or an all-time record, whether it was a high or a low. Is that good? Is that bad? There are a few red flags. We actually do a consumer survey, and you're starting to see that the impact of those high prices, the lack of inventory, is starting to discourage some home buyers, So we do a home purchase sentiment index where we talk to 1,000 California consumers every month. 2 of the questions that we ask are, is it a good time to sell a home? And is it a good time to buy a home? And what you can see here is the difference between the two. If you subtract off good time to sell from good time to buy, what you can see is that seller's advantage, right? The amount more optimistic people are about selling a home than buying was also at an all-time high, right? So buyer confidence seems like it is taking it on the chin as folks get outbid. They put in a lot of offers and never end up getting the property. They see rates going up. They see the homes getting more expensive, and they maybe decide to wait, or at very least has a kind of psychological impact. But it does seem like it's having more more than just the psychological impact, because when you look at these mortgage applications, and this is the annual growth in mortgage applications on a weekly basis. So comparing last week to the same week back in 2020, and what you can see is that after 52 consecutive weeks of growth where we saw mortgage applications growing compared to where they were last year, we had 2 consecutive weeks in a row where applications are now falling, and that follows about 2.5 months where those had been decelerating from about 50 to 60% annualized increases. And one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, even as we were looking at 60 or 70% increases over the course of the last couple of months, part of that is because we're comparing it to when mortgage applications were falling off a cliff at this time last year, right? So if I give you $1 and you only had $1, that's 100% increase, but you still only got $2, right? So there's that kind of exaggerated growth effect coming in because we're at such a low level of mortgage applications. In fact, if you look at where the applications index is now, we're not seeing that many more people apply to get mortgages than we did at the same time in 2019, right? So buyer demand is strong, but we don't want to kid ourselves and think that we can just throw our business in cruise control and kind of ride this wave of buyer demand, and that we're going to continue to maintain the 60 and 70% increase, and 2021 is going to be a kind of cruise control year for us as individual realtors, right? And that's what I kind of want you to keep in mind as you even interpret our data, right? Because we're now, mortgage applications tend to lead home sales. And so when you look at our market releases that are going to be coming up, you're probably going to start to see home sales that are going to be growing by 40 and 50 and 60% on a year-to-year basis. That's because, again, we're starting to get to the period in time where sales were falling off a cliff at this time last year. And indeed, if you look at the actual aggregate level of home sales, yes, they were up 65% in April. But what you can see visually in this chart is that we're not able to maintain that 510,000 unit pace that we were at the end of 2020. We're still running a 460,000 unit pace. That's still better than we've seen for the better part of the last 10 to 15 years, but we're not able to hang on to that momentum that is built up primarily because of the lack of inventory and what it's doing to prices and affordability, right? Which kind of begs the question of whether prices are overheated. And I want to share with you now some analysis that I did looking at the end of last year, because we were getting that question a lot as we got to the end of the year, right? We were seeing home prices that were up a ton. And so I did some fundamental analysis just asking where prices should be, right? When people ask me about whether we're in a housing bubble, what they're really asking is what should prices look like in California? And are we there? Are we too high? Are we too low? What have you? And so there's ways that we can try and deconstruct what prices should look like, just looking at some of the fundamental things that determine what matters for home prices, right? One of the things that I want to point out is inflation. And even though we're not in a kind of hyperinflation period like we were in the late 70s, early 80s that drove the kind of 15% mortgage interest rates that it really took to kind of get inflation under control, we've had very stable and moderate inflation for the last 30 years, but we've still had inflation nonetheless. In fact, if you look at the California Consumer Price Index, it's gone up by about 2.5 times from where it was at the end of the 1980s. So just in general, the cost of goods and services, the cost of everything has gone up pretty significantly. Gas, utilities, groceries, haircuts, what have you, right? Just in general. And that automatically should have added something to home prices, just because like home prices are determined by the cost of everything else in the economy. And so that is one source that should have driven prices up. But we have nonetheless seen from that same point in time, right, the end of the 1980s, right up through the end of last year, that the median price went from $150,000 in California to over almost $15,000 dollars by the end of 2020. And that's what gets people freaked out, right? You can see visually that we're higher than we were during the peak of the last housing cycle, right? We're at all-time high levels, and it's about 5 times what it was back at the end of the 1980s. So prices have indeed risen tremendously during that time. But in addition to just having normal inflation, we've also been going through an era that has been punctuated by a marked decline in mortgage interest rates, and actually we've gone from those double-digit mortgage rates down to just 3%. And so what that means in a state that's so inventory constrained like California is that usually declines in interest rates, which would otherwise, in maybe some other state show up as increased savings, right? But in California, people don't pocket those savings. The market is so tight. If you get any windfall from lower rates, what you end up doing is being able to offer a higher price for that home to ensure that you're the one that gets it without affecting your monthly payment and screwing up all those ratios that the mortgage bankers care so much about. And so what this ended up doing wasn't resulting in a lower cost of housing for Californians out there. It ended up getting passed on to home sellers in the form of higher prices that came with this increased purchasing power. And indeed, if you fold both the lower rates and the inflation together, to not look at the price of the home, but to look at the actual monthly payment on that home in 2020 dollars. So I've taken all the inflation out of this. These are all based in 2020 dollars, right? Going all the way back to the end of the 1980s. What you can see is that median priced home doesn't cost you much more in terms of that monthly mortgage payment than it did on, from a historical average standpoint, which was about $2,700. It's actually lower than it was at the end of the 1980s when that median priced home cost you about $3,800 in real terms. It's certainly nowhere near where it was in 2006, right? Where it was costing almost $5,000 a month. And so, to me, what this means is that if you look at home prices at the end of 2020, although they seem really high at face value, when you look at the fundamentals, most of this can be explained by the fact that interest rates have come down incredibly over the course of the last 35 years, and that just the cost of everything in general is about 2.5 times what it was. And if you factor both of those pieces in, prices weren't particularly inflated. The composition of this $3,200 a month payment is different, right? It's based now on really high prices and really low interest rates instead of back in the 80s when it cost you $3,200 a month in real terms, but it was because you had low prices and really high rates. That fundamental level of the payment hasn't changed that much. The other thing that we have to account for as well in this equation is what's happened with incomes. And those have also gone up alongside inflation. And so if we take that $3,200 a month payment that I just showed you and divide it by the median household income in California, what you can see is that median home consumes just about 43% of that median household's income. Now, that's a higher number than what you would see in another state, right? Like in a Florida, in a Nevada, in a Texas, that number is probably about 30%, high 20s, something like that. But what you don't see is that this number is incredibly inflated relative to where it is by historic standards here in California, right? We're at our basically normal levels of unaffordability, right? We're less affordable than every other state, but we're not particularly inflated once you account for interest rates, inflation, and how much money people here in this state actually make. There's a lot more inequality, right? There's a lot less folks who can actually afford to buy that median priced home, but the folks who are buying it aren't necessarily stretching a lot farther. It's just a much more narrow slice of the population base that's able to get into those homes. Look, this is bad news for housing, for home ownership, right? But it doesn't mean that the housing market is unsustainable and that prices are going to tank. Those are two very different questions. And so that is kind of one way of assessing how much systemic risk there is looking at prices and seeing how much of it we can explain away just based on absolute fundamentals. We can also flip that thought experiment on its head and say, instead of looking at prices where they actually are, where should prices be? We know how much people make in terms of income. We know what interest rates are. We know how much people should spend of their income to make that house payment. So if they were just spending the right amount of money on their income at current interest rates, where would prices actually be? And you can actually do that calculation. Good news is you don't have to. I already did that calculation here for you. But if you actually look at just what part of home prices is explained just by rates and incomes, you end up with a home price that's somewhere between $515,000 and about $600,000 in California at the end of last year. Well, we can go ahead and compare that to the actual $715,000 median price or so and see how close to that kind of market clearing price, that price that we'd get to if there was absolutely no supply constraints, that everybody had access to mortgage market, everybody had 20% down payments, that price would be somewhere around $600,000 or so. And if you actually do that comparison, right, the comparison between this orange line and these blue bars, right, where prices should be and where they actually are, again, you can see that we're at basically historic norms, right? We're right on top of that 30-year average, which is this red line that I'm showing you. It's 20% above the market clearing price, right? And this is kind of how, just as a total aside, a lot of people always say that's because California is a nice place to live. California is always going to be more expensive. To me, I think that this is how you go about quantifying that nice place to live effect, right? Because we're always, historically about 20% higher than just what that, full zero constraint price level would be. But that's where we were at the end of 2020. Again, this wasn't particularly inflated. We didn't have prices that were just so far above what you would expect to see if people were just spending the right amount of money on their income. They weren't, 115% higher than that market clearing price the way that they were back in 2006-07. So to me, I wasn't that worried about housing bubble, even at a $715,000 median price, as I look back towards the end of 2020. Unfortunately, over the last 3 months, we've seen prices go up by another $100,000. And so now I know NAR put out a piece that said this time's different. There's no systemic risk. I do think that we've seen an increase in systemic risk. I don't think that you can just, scoff it off and say this is nothing to worry about. What I think we need to do is have an understanding of the magnitude of the risk that we've come, because again, incomes aren't growing by the 35% that we see prices going up by, right? And so that means that affordability has suffered. So the question isn't whether there's more risk, it's how much extra risk now is sloshing around in the system. Now, rates have also come down over the last year, right? So this time last year, we were still at about 3.3%. So that kind of monthly payment was only up by 30%, not the 35% that went up in terms of the overall price. But again, incomes didn't go up by 30% even, right? And so we can start to make some assumptions about what that's going to mean for those kind of fundamental calculations that I just walked you through. And even if we assume, which I think is really generous, that incomes over the last year have grown by 10%, which, show me a worker who was out there negotiating 10% wage increases during the middle of the pandemic. I don't think it happened. So, but the moral of the story is, even under this generous assumption of income growth, what you still see is that we have basically doubled the amount of systemic risk that's out there in the market. We went from basically being dead on that historic norm of 21% above that market clearing price, where we were basically right at the nice place to live kind of premium level. Now we're double the nice place to live level. So that doesn't mean that we're going to collapse, right? We didn't see the market fall apart last time until we got to more than double what that market clearing price should be. And I'm not saying that there won't be a decline in home prices. There might be. We're not forecasting that. We don't think that's likely. But if it happens and the worst case scenario does come to fruition, we're looking at price declines that are in the neighborhood of like 15%, not 60% like last time when they got cut in half. And so, again, we don't think this is likely, but I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't acknowledge that there was an increase in systemic risk as we get prices that grow so out of whack with incomes, right? And so in a worst case scenario, we still think that, prices are only looking at a 10 to 15, maybe 20 on the outside percent decline, which, the reason why that matters for your clients is that still makes it a good time to buy if you're getting into a home that you can afford and you're planning on being there for a number of years to build that home equity, right? That number still pencils out, and there's still a lot of benefits. There's also, I think, a lot less potential for those snowball effects that we saw back in 2007, 8, and 9, because we had different fundamentals coming into this crisis, right? As my 10-year-old daughter always likes to sing around the house, the bones were good. We didn't have those, same kind of fundamental imbalances that we had under the hood of the economy, first and foremost in the mortgage market, right? If you go back to 2005, about half the mortgages we were originating were 5/1 option arms, right? That means that even if you kept your job, even if you made the monthly payment they asked you to make, you weren't hitting all the amortization. You could just wake up one day and all of a sudden your mortgage payment went up by $1,500 a month, right? And that meant that, you know, even folks who were relatively unscathed by the initial effects of the crisis, you know, were not in a sustainable mortgage product. There was a kind of ticking time bomb element to the mortgage market that we just didn't have this time around. That's been less than 20% of the market going into the crisis, and that has been the case for the better part of the last decade. In fact, I think you could make a very strong argument that we've been too tight on mortgage lending, right? We haven't let enough people in. We've had the FICO score requirements too high, all of that stuff. And so what that means is just that, again, you don't have that ticking time bomb element that just is kind of waiting for an economic shock like a Bear Stearns, a Lehman Brothers, a coronavirus, what have you, to really just get that cascade of impacts going on what was much deeper fundamental issues bubbling under the surface. This doesn't mean we're immune to the effects of the crisis. And you know, I already showed you, we lost 2.7 million jobs last year. But what it didn't do was lead to all these other knock-on impacts that kind of take us to a 10-year jobless recovery that we had back in 2008. The other big difference from last time is that we didn't use our house-like bank accounts, right? If you go back to 2005, 6, and 7, we looked up and our homes had doubled in value. We were all rich. And guess what we did? We bought boats. We took everybody on that giant cruise to Hawaii. We went to Europe and, you know, went to Oktoberfest and ate sausages and did all that stuff. And what you can see here was that it wasn't until 2020 when actually home prices started growing by 20% that you started to see an uptick in cash out refis, right? And even then, you're talking about a fraction of the equity that was cashed out last time around. And this is on home prices that were actually at all-time high levels. So actually, as a percentage, right, there's more home equity now than there has been in a very, very long time. A much smaller percentage of home equity has been liquidated. And what that means is that, again, folks still have skin in the game. So they don't have that mortgage product that's going to blow up in their face and see their payment go up by $2,000 a month, right? And then you look at that in the context of having literally zero equity because it's already parked in the driveway with a brand new motor in it, right? And then it makes absolute sense to just throw your keys back to the bank. You don't foreclose on a home that you have equity in just because you lose your job, especially not in a market environment like the one I showed you, where homes are selling in 6 days and going for 3% above asking price. You sell it, right? And so that, again, doesn't mean that not, you know, everyone's going to avoid foreclosure, but you don't have that strategic incentive for the mass foreclosures that we saw last time around. And indeed, when you look at the mortgage delinquency numbers, they've been falling now for the last 3 quarters in a row, even as they peaked at roughly half the level that we saw back in 2006. Again, that doesn't mean that we're saying, you know, we get off scot-free and that this has no implications for the housing market. What it means is that, you know, when you look at the folks who are getting out of forbearance, they're not posing a huge systemic risk. And I'm not going to belabor this chart because it's a little bit confusing, but basically 85% of the people who have gotten into forbearance and subsequently gotten out have done so in a way that poses minimal risk of foreclosure. They either added all the payments on to the end of their loan, which, you know, if you get your job back, you can just pay for 31 years instead of 30 years. That's not problematic. Some people never missed payments. Some people missed payments and already paid it back. That's already 2/3 of the people in forbearance right there. And so, you know, again, when you kind of project it all out, it doesn't mean that every single person's going to be able to stay in the home, but it just means that we're looking at a foreclosure market next year that's in the single digits, not 60% of the housing stock next year. Not everyone's going to be able to hang on, but you're not going to see a bunch of banks in a hurry to boot people out of homes that there's home equity in, you know, and shoot themselves in the foot by creating a much deeper crisis. What I do think this crisis does is makes our inventory challenges more pressing. Again, statewide, we ended the month last in April with less than 20,000 homes available for sale across all the MLSs in the state. And so you don't have to be a mathematician to realize that 20,000 listings times 12 months doesn't add up to the 510,000 home sales that we need to kind of maintain this pace. Now, this is a moving target, right? Active listings are changing all the time. Stuff's being listed, stuff's being closed, and so all that. But we've seen the active number down by 50% now for more than 4 months in a row, and it's been down by double digits for the last 2.5 years running. And that is why even as rates were falling, so was affordability, right? Like even with 3% interest rates, affordability was getting worse. And now that rates are done falling and prices are going up by 35%, that affordability crisis is going to start to get much more pressing because we don't have the offsetting effect of falling rates to cushion some of that blow. So this is going to hit our buyers right on the chin. It's going to hit our communities of color in particular on the chin. They're the groups that have lower income. And unfortunately, you're less than half as likely to be able to afford the median priced home if you're Black and Latinx in California than you would be if you're a Black and Latinx in any other state in the nation. That's a problem, not just for us as realtors, that's an economic problem, right? You don't have to look much farther than that to explain why everybody's moving to Texas, Nevada, and Arizona. It's not because they like 110-degree heat in Scottsdale. It's because, you know, you can afford a home and not have to have 4 jobs to be able to do it. And again, that's before rates are rising. And I won't nerd out too bad on the technical conversation about interest rates, but I do think that we're looking at another 30, 40 basis points in rates going up over the short run, maybe to about 3.5%, and over the medium term of the next couple of years, maybe 4.5% or so. And that is, you know, again, still an interest rate that my dad would have killed for back in the 80s. But at an $815,000 median price point, those hit a lot harder, even with small increases in mortgage rates. And of course, it all just means that we got to get busy building, or people are going to get busy moving, right? And you can see that we have, these are building permits in California. We've never built as much as the state says we have to build every year, except 5 times in the last 33 years, right? You can't go from a 25 million person state to a 40 million person state and habitually underbuild and expect anything else to happen except for prices to go up, right? It's like having a popular concert venue. Imagine having, you know, the Rolling Stones at a show, and every year you get rid of 5,000 more seats from the stadium. What do you think is going to happen to that ticket price every year? It's just going to keep going up and up and up. And you don't have to look much farther than that to realize that, you know, we've got some of the lowest vacancy rates in the entire nation, that we had the all-time low vacancy number or inventory number in December, that we had an $815,000 median price, that we're the second worst state in the country for rent burden households that pay too much of their income just on housing costs, that we're the second worst state in the nation for overcrowded homes. Not only are people spending too much, they're having to do it with like 6 of their buddies, right? And so this becomes very problematic. And the one that matters most is that we're the poorest state in the nation, not in the estimates for poverty that use a one-size-fits-all poverty line that's the same whether you're in Toledo, Ohio, or Beverly Hills, California, but the supplemental poverty estimates that the Census Bureau does, which do account for the cost of living. Again, California is the poorest state in the nation, and you don't have to go much farther than that to explain, you know, what Ross Perot called the giant sucking sound, except for he was explaining the giant sucking sound of our manufacturing jobs down to Mexico. This is the housing is the giant sucking sound, sucking more people out of California and into those states that, for, you know, frankly, are offering a higher quality of life because people don't have to pay an arm and a leg to live there. And indeed, if you look on the right-hand side, 2020 was the first year in recorded history in 120 years of collecting California population data that California's population actually shrank, right? So you don't have to look much farther than economies like Japan to see how hard it is to overcome a shrinking population base, right? You can have the most productive workforce in the entire world, but if your population is shrinking, you can't have an economy that's growing, and that is going to become problematic. It's already been problematic for us in real estate, right? We've been struggling to get above 400,000 home sales for the last decade, but this is going to start to become a problem for businesses. You want to hire a manager, right? You want to build a home. There's no construction workers. You want to send your kids to school. There's no teachers left who can afford to live here, all of that stuff. And so it's going to become a much more widespread problem. And that's why even as we're kind of optimistic, and I shared with you how strong the housing market data is, I wanted to throw the wet blanket on and kind of get you out of a cruise control mentality, because even as you're going to see us report 50 and 60% growth over the next couple of months, we're actually expecting that sales are going to cool down quite significantly, and we're going to fall from that 510,000 unit pace that we were at the beginning of the year towards a 460,000 unit pace. That's still a good number, but it means you still need to keep your foot on the accelerator, get out there and drum up those listings, beat the clients over the head on the buy side and the sell side with the data, right? It's the value of home ownership is still there. It's a great time to sell. Rates are still low by historic standards, but we do expect prices to keep going up, right? And that means that affordability is going to be even more challenging, especially as rates continue to go up. And I know I've gone on at length, so I'll just say, yeah, the housing market's doing good. No, you don't want to just kind of kick back and throw it in autopilot. We do have more systemic risk. And for me, that's why we really need to focus on supply, both in terms of just drumming up listings, right? Getting people who weren't about to sell, telling everyone about Prop 19 and they can take their property taxes with them and all that good stuff. And also getting out there and advocating for new housing developments, because, unfortunately, unless they build homes, we're not going to have any homes left to sell here in a couple of years. And so it's in everybody's interest to be able to do that. You can get these slides off our website. I will send these to Janet and Wendy and Maggie and everybody after this call as well. And again, I would just say thank you so much to Janet, Wendy, Barbara, Maggie, and everybody for letting me come back and share what I think is hopefully some good stuff that will help you have those conversations with your clients this year.